Hi, I wonder if you could help me out. I am looking to hire a global head of growth for Automated Creative. So a little bit about us. We're on a mission to help brands turn their impressions into intelligence. We have a technology that researches consumers by analysing how they respond to optimise paid advertising. It's very fancy, very cool, and very successful for brands like Adidas, Samsung, Diageo, Reckitt, KFC, Pernod Ricard, Bose, Unilever, GSK, and people like NCS. So we've been doing brilliant work for the past few years, and we want to hire someone that can help us grow our portfolio of exciting and innovative clients. So if you or someone you know have been working in sales or new business for the last 10 or 15 years and would like to talk to us about the position, please could you give me an email on tom@automatedcreative.net. Right, on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this is a podcast about the future of marketing. Every week or so, I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing one of our industry's leaders, and this week is no different whatsoever. I'm on a call with Benni Lickfett, who is Global Head of Digital Innovation at Diageo. I met Benni a few years ago when I met him in a coffee shop and said, I've got this idea for a business called Automated Creative. What do you think? And Benni said, yeah, I'd buy that. So I think if you hadn't said that, in some ways, I may not even be an entrepreneur and a startup guy. So it's a real treat to have Benni on the podcast. But Benni, for those in the audience who don't know who you are and what you do, could you give them a bit of background?
Sure. Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. Always good to hear that story, especially because I actually ended up buying the service, not just talking about it. That's always a good litmus test. So a bit about myself. So I am based in London. I'm currently the global head of digital innovation at Diageo. So those of you who don't know Diageo, we're a premium spirits company with over 200 brands around the world, including brands like Johnny Walker, Baileys, Guinness, and lots of other brilliant brands. But as most people, I obviously didn't start out my career there. I actually went to university in Boston with a big ambition of actually going into international relations or politics. And then after one internship at the UN, I realized that's a very frustrating way to make a living. So I had the interesting opportunity straight out of university to join a startup in Stockholm. I was literally employee number one, just joining a sort of serial founder and a very good developer. Back then, the heyday of search engine optimization and aggregators like Kelco and others in Europe. So we built a great business around comparing first media products and then financial services. So a real startup environment where you sort of day one drive to IKEA, buy a desk, build it, and figure out what to do the rest of the day. But what I really realized, what I had a big passion for, is building the community, building the brand, the communications. So did that in that company and realized while it was brilliant learning, it was also very much self-taught. So then I went into a bit more structured learning, joined a company called Profit that based in New York. That was founded by David Acker and Scott Galloway, who some of you might know, but a brilliant company that looks at innovation strategy, brand strategy, and was really back then one of the first that could talk about, the power of a brand to a CFO and still managed to sound credible. So I worked with these guys for numerous years on big corporates, helping a lot on innovation and brand growth strategy. But at some point, I wanted to do something entrepreneurial again. So I actually started a company with one of my brothers, which is one of those things that every management book tells you not to do. But we still had a very good run. My brother is still running that business, which is a specialist e-com player. And then I went on to actually do an MBA because I think if we would have both continued working together, it probably would have been a bit challenging. But did an MBA. After the MBA, I dabbled a bit more in innovation consulting, design consulting, and then started another company, which was more of a passion project. So it was a social impact company which was an exciting ride, but a bit of an implosion for various reasons, and definitely great learning. But after that, I was sort of licking my wounds and actually did some work with Diageo, first as a consultant, because I'd worked in the startup position with Diageo a bit. They brought me in to look at their marketing innovation, marketing tech pipelines. So how do you identify interesting MarTech? How do you bring it into the organization? How do you make it easier to really get test live, to have constant experimentation, test and learn and all that? And I was able to build a bit of a team around that and a function and a process, first in Europe, and now I do that globally. And as I said, so it has been 5 years doing that, and here I am.
Wow, that is quite the story. So what I'm curious to know, what is the most useful thing that you learn in a startup that you apply in a large corporate?
I think the probably most important element is just context. And I think once you've been through a startup environment where you literally never know how long the cash is going to last and really have that existential threat constantly, it brings real clarity and urgency. And I think it's something in a corporate environment that helps you a lot to prioritize, focus on the big stuff, get more confident in saying no and cutting out some of the clutter. But it also really helps to just manage stress levels, right? Because you can put things into perspective. And I remember even when I was working in sort of brand consulting in New York, there was a bit saying on the wall that just said, so brands don't kill, right? And I think I never really fully got it back then, because you were up till 2, working on some client deliverable deadline. But it's, I think with adding different experiences, you get to a point where you say, okay, they're really important, essential things, but there are a lot of things that cause stress, even though they don't, they're no relation to the actual output. So I think that the ability to keep perspective and context in mind is a pretty key one to manage that pressure.
I don't understand the brands don't kill point. What was that? Was that Scott Galloway wrote that in?
That might very well be. I think the idea was just like, guys, remember, we're here to have fun. And while clients, why we put ourselves in the pressure where we might say, okay, oh my God, the font on slide 14 for this big CMO presentation is still wrong. What are we going to do about it? It's just the ability to step back and say, okay, it's not just about brands, it's about business, it's about people, it's about society, and look at the big picture. And it is a job, right? And you can be passionate about and do great work, but don't kill yourself over it.
So what new belief or behaviors have you subscribed to in the last few years since your startup period?
Yeah, I think since then, I guess building a bit on what I was saying before, I think I've gotten a lot better at focusing on the essentials and being a lot more honest and transparent with the people around me, stakeholders around me, around what my goals are, what I want to achieve, what I think we should collectively focus on. But I think it's really that behavior of being able to have that focus and full accountability and trying to do, one thing right rather than a lot of things half-baked. And I think that's especially difficult in corporate environments where you just have so many different stakeholders with different interests. So I think that's something where I've matured a lot. And it's also things like clarity in what you say and how you say it, right? And again, I think through my career, you often find yourself in a situation where you kind of try to make things complex to impress somebody or showcase your knowledge in the area, right? And I mean, we all know it in marketing is obviously a big culprit, very guilty of this. So people just so acronym, quite frankly, bullshit, a lot of bullshit terminology that it almost sets barriers for others not to understand, right? And where you're only in a small circle of marketing insiders will understand what you're talking about and nobody else. And what that really does, it puts up barriers to bridge silos, to connect with others, to bring in different opinions. And I would hope I've gotten a lot better at that, even though I'm sure I'm still guilty of that sometimes.
So that's good advice. But what is the bad advice that you hear in the innovation game that you wish wasn't around, or the bad recommendations?
Yeah, I find it slightly irritating how often I will sit in a presentation by an agency or an innovation company, and they talk to you about how great failure is and how you must fail. And that's I get the sentiment what they're trying to do, but failure is never great, and it's really about the insights and the learning behind it. And while you should should have the ability to experiment and to try things, it is about doing that in a very lean and smart way. But it also only makes sense if you're learning in the process and if you're actually chasing a goal worth chasing. And sometimes that idea that you have to go through failure to get to success, I think is a bit glorified, and understanding that in a corporate environment where majority of people in the organization, their job is to reduce risk and to take that out and optimize profit. It takes a lot to be the person who writes on the fact that they're purposefully failing, right? And it's probably certain environment it's okay, but a lot of them it's not. So it just seems like one of those slogans to me that very few people actually live up to, right?
Yeah, I always struggled with that when my role was an innovation role, is that you sort of got pumped up on Californian failure porn, basically, where you're like, right, we need to, just fail loads of times and do it like with this crazy speed, move fast and break things is the Facebook thing that seems to stick around.
Yeah.
But if you're failing 9 times out of 10, the absolute crushing pain of that is so bewildering that by the time you get to the one win, all anyone can remember is the 9 things that didn't go very well. So I like your idea of learning being the win. So even if something doesn't work out or hit the metric or the target, as long as you as a person and the organization has learned, then it's not a failure, right? So I think that's what I take from that point. But as we move on, I'd love to know, what is that best marketing tip? What is that kind of golden nugget of advice that you've heard either recently or through the years that you find yourself sharing or repeating most often?
Yeah, one piece of advice that I really, really like, which I got a long time ago, and that was actually by a guy. So I grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, and there was a guy called Jörg Leipziger who was a bit the father of German communications and public relations, who founded the first PR agency, really. But he really got communications. Fascinating guy. He was grew up as a skiing instructor in Switzerland, then went to the army and started this communication company just because he had such a good understanding of the basics of communication and how when A sends a message to B, how is that being perceived and how can you work with that. But one of the pieces of advice he gave me was that empathy is the foundation of all good marketing. Right. And I always thought that was a really interesting one because it's quite a broad concept. But the idea of that good marketeers can put themselves into the shoes of others and see something from different perspectives and what it takes to actually build that skill. Right. And if you look at how often decisions are being made about, a product targeted at senior citizens with a bunch of, hipsters sitting in Soho brainstorming around it, or then their main source of insight will be an insight group where, pay a bunch of people to sit around the table and give you the answers they think you want to hear, right? You quite quickly get into the idea, actually empathy translated into real understanding and stretching your own point of views and opening up to diversity is such a fundamental key thing that you need to do as a marketeer. And quite frankly, I think there are a lot of marketeers out there that are arrogant, which is probably the exact opposite of empathy in some ways.
And so, assuming that's correct, you know that I have a business built on that premise. But what are the ways that brands can be more empathetic, other than not just hiring 6 hipsters having a coffee in Soho?
So I think there are lots of ways. I think diversity within an organization is a key way to do that, to actually ensure that you have a breadth of opinion and different perspectives, right? I think actually ensuring that you're not too removed in an ivory tower, but that you go out and meet consumers and that you make that part of your of your training and your understanding, just getting as close to the customer or consumer as possible is really important. But I think to your point around sources of research, how do you broaden that set and not just use traditional research? How do you use A/B testing as much as possible, right? Get things in front of consumers in a real life environment and understand how they react to different propositions, to different things, and not doing that in a theoretical way, but really getting hands-on, getting stuck in it. And much, again, if we take the basis of how a lot of startups do, where you throw your product out there, you have your minimum viable product, and you learn from that, you build on that, and you use the live data and reaction to evolve it. I think that's too many organizations are just too far away from their consumers or customers.
Today's episode is brought to you by Media for All, which was set up to help encourage more Black, Asian, and other ethnic talent into media, and to provide a support and mentoring network to ensure talent flourishes in the media industry that we all love. If you're looking for a mentor or would like to mentor young ethnic talent, check them out at mediaforall.org.uk, and it is all 100% free. So we're at the halfway stage now, and we're going to talk about your shiny new object, which is the unfulfilled promise of crowd wisdom and crowdsourcing. So I think I know what that is, but can you explain to the audience what do you mean by that and why you think it represents the future of the industry?
Yeah, let's hope I know what that is, actually, what I'm talking about here. But so this comes a bit from my experience, as I said, the social impact startup I was in, which unfortunately did not go as we had envisioned. But so the idea, there was the heyday of technology enabling that wisdom of the crowd, right? And you have some brilliant examples of it, probably leading is something like Wikipedia, also a Waze, right, that helps you navigate through it, or you had a Kickstarter and the Pebble Watch. And what's sort of the idea, if you actually use sort of the hive mind and all that knowledge, but also crowd, that we can create better brands, better services, a better world, right? And that seems like, looking back at that now, it seems to never have fully lived up to that potential, right? So while you have certain examples of people doing that, it didn't impact, I think, things like business model innovation and real big far-reaching concepts as much as it could have. And if you think about how rare it is, I mean, I've been building on what we talked about before, right? Opening up, democratizing your brand and having really sort of powerful mechanisms. There's so few brands that do that. Some examples are somebody like a Lego, who actually allowed their consumers to create toys and then get a revenue of the concepts that are being sold. Or you have the Xbox Labs, where people can create their own Xbox designer and controller designs and sell that or get a kickback from that. But mostly what's happening is the crowd picking crisp flavors rather than driving real change. And you see some nuggets, I think, if you go a bit outside of the brand world into areas like now in the fight against COVID, where scientists would put all sorts of information out there to collaborate on it together, where you get a glimpse of what's possible. And I would just hope and love to see a lot more of that, both from brands opening up as well as in society to tackle problems.
So why isn't it working? Why has the dream not been realized? And the Lego example and Xbox is fantastic. So why aren't brands, why isn't marketing using the collective wisdom of the crowd?
Yeah, I think part of it is probably organizations not wanting to be as transparent or as open. But I think a big part of it is not being able to drive the engagement necessary to really, trigger that change. And when you see examples of companies who do it well, I think those are examples of companies really manage to build a strong community and have that constant dialogue. There's some fashion companies who do that too, who will send before they actually release a new collection, where they have a sort of a core community of real strong brand ambassadors, I guess, or people who are really involved in the category, who will give them that initial read or feedback. And so some companies get it right, but it requires you to have that real connection with the core community that's linked to your brand and have that passion point that they're willing to collaborate with you and co-create out of their passion for the category and for the brand, rather than being paid for it.
And do you think it's only a certain type of business that can do it? I mean, a company that springs to mind is giffgaff. They've got an incredible community where the product is defined, I think even marketed by them to a degree. But it surprises me, but it seems to be a very high interest category. Lego, obviously, there's just this huge community of crazy Lego users, all from kids all the way to seniors, and obviously gaming, high interest, high passion. But so is it really only those kind of sectors where this could work, or is there like a toothpaste community out there that should really be helping toothpaste brands define what their marketing is and their messaging is?
Well, I think that's the wonderful and scary side to the internet. You can find a niche audience and those people that are absolutely obsessed with their toothpaste texture. Actually, if you do that globally, you probably have a community big enough to really be keen to have their voice heard and get involved. And I think that's almost true for every category. And even I would love to see, financial service organizations to flip that over or open up to actually invite that type of collaboration. So I think it can be done in all categories. I think, pretty much all categories. I think sometimes it might have to work through collaboration, right? And obviously, if you're a company that wants to develop a product for, the e-gaming or community, it's probably a lot easier to partner with a Twitch and collaborate with their community to achieve that than trying to build your own credibility within that community. So I think sometimes the answer is more in collaboration and tapping into existing networks. What you still need is, I think, the agility and the ability to really take that into account, co-create, and move at speed to keep that momentum and really listen to those communities, which is a tough skill for a lot of organizations, especially CPGs, who would look at certain manufacturing cycles or way of producing things. You're really disrupting the way you think about creating products or validating them.
If someone's listening to this and they're like, Benny's got a point here, why are we just relying on our agency to come up with all the ideas? Why aren't we going to the crowd? Or why is our R&D always just come from the same group of people in the same building or the same team? What's the best way to get started with using crowd wisdom or crowdsourcing?
Yeah, I think for a lot of organizations, a good way to start first is internally, to actually really try these methodologies with your own employees, right? And that's sort of classic open innovation internally. And there are lots of different providers out there that enable you to have a platform where people can post ideas or where you can collaborate at that scale. I think that's probably a first good step to sort of understand the dynamics of it a bit more, and then reach out to existing communities and use these learnings to start exploring in it. I think it's not from a technological side, the solutions are all out there. It's more a cultural shift to be open towards it. And then obviously the sort of resource or dedication to really to listen and be committed to actually give it a try and to learn as part of that experience.
And tell me who you think are the leaders from a technology perspective, who was really enabling brands, businesses to use crowdsourcing?
Well, there are lots of different innovation platforms out there. I probably don't want to call out one specifically, but if you look at sort of open innovation platforms, there's some really widely used, some more tailored at smaller organizations or bigger organizations. So it's a really mature market out there. Interestingly, often they they might enable this kind of thing in software companies, in tech companies, where that way of working is a lot more established. But increasingly, I think we see them in the big CPGs and other organizations as well. And then, I mean, beyond that, even having a look at your Kickstarters, your Indiegogos, all the big crowdfunding platforms out there, to understand the dynamics of these campaigns and what makes them succeed or fail and what the crowd reacts to and how they participate, I think is really, really valuable learning as well.
So when does it go wrong? What are the watch outs? And when you've tried it or observed other people trying it, what goes wrong when there's a good intention from a brand or a team that is somehow when the idea meets the crowd, it doesn't produce the outcome that they were after?
Yeah, I think the answer is a bit in the way you phrased that question too. In this, and I think there are a lot of organizations who try to lead the witness, right? So they want to use the crowd to validate something that they think would be a great idea, and that's obviously defeating the purpose. And the crowd, they're smart. That's the whole point. It is the hive mind. They will call you out on it. So I think it's really being brutally honest with yourself that you're doing this to really get input and not just as a sort of marketing tool or to validate something that you want to do. I think that's the first step. And then also having that commitment that you're going to really follow through on it, right? Because there have been some examples where brands invite the crowd to say something, and then if they didn't like the answer, they didn't manage that well, and they really struggled with it. So I think it's getting the right buy-in, commitment to do it, and being honest about really listening to the answers you're getting. One
of the criticisms that I've heard about crowdsourcing in a marketing context is the understanding of a brand. For example, everyone's heard of Domino's, for example, quite sort of famous innovative marketing brands. And lots of people could easily come up with ideas for Domino's, but if they don't actually fully understand the values of the brand and some of the time the information around those values is confidential. And if you're putting out a brief to millions of people, you're also showing your hand a little bit. So how do you think brands can get around the challenge of briefing a massive group of people without giving away strategic information or confidential data?
Yeah, and again, I think there are different ways doing that. So I think when we talk about crowdsourcing, it doesn't need to be sort of co-creation of a completely new product, right? It could be the validation of a value proposition or co-developing a slogan or a new service element or something else. But even if it's really sensitive, there's obviously sometimes a way to test things without involving the brand, right? Especially media testing, where you just strip it off the brand. Sometimes there are communities that are small beta communities, but that function more like a actual community rather than a focus group. There are organizations or companies like Street Bees, right, who allow you to test or get research and insights in the field to do that. So I think it is a pretty complex space because you have so many different variations of how you can do it. So like most things, right, it needs to start, I think, with a very good brief, being clear on what is it you're trying to achieve, and then looking at that full portfolio of different crowdsourcing or crowd validations options that you have that you can use. But there are definitely some out there, and I've used those in the past before, where you can either mask the brand or make it in a very confidential way so you don't get into hot water there. Small risk, you can even those have, and this has happened before, luckily not to me, but I've seen other brands where somebody takes a screenshot or can sort of deduct which brand it is. So that's a risk you need to be willing to take to some degree.
So we're going to have to leave it there because we're at the end of the podcast. Although I feel we should be talking about this for a good few hours. And it's been a really good conversation for me because I'd pretty much forgotten all about that approach. So it's hopefully this will reignite that as a possibility for the marketers listening to this show. But Benni, difficult question. If someone wants to get in touch with you, how do you want them to do that? And what makes a great outreach to you?
Yeah, so I mean, LinkedIn is quite good for that. That being said, I get quite a lot of messages. So generally, I mean, if there's any connection reference point, somebody that can intro you, or that we have in common, or even somewhere we met, that's always really helpful. What doesn't tend to work is if you just copy a piece out of my bio and tell me, since you're in charge of doing this and that, we thought you'd be interested in our sort of enterprise tech solution. So the more targeted, obviously, the better, and just to take a bit of that effort to just make it relevant. And I'll look at all of them, right? And it's my job, so I'm always happy for relevant inbound. So leads are coming in, but yeah, just make it relevant, and it does help if you don't have business development in your title.
Fantastic. Benni, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Hi. Just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the shiny new Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That would just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.